It's a bloody chair. Make it comfortable. And I'm a bit like this with digital health. Why should it be that the exception is me going, ooh, that was a seamless experience?
Hi, I'm Caitlin,
And I'm Clarinda, and this is Not Just Patients,
a podcast where we break barriers to meaningful patient involvement in healthcare.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Our guest today is Mark Duman, who is here to talk to us about digital health and health data.
Mark Duman is a clinician, management consultant, and patient advocate who works with organisations to improve their products and services by unlocking the full potential of patient and public engagement. Working with the NHS, the King's Fund, the BBC, and as founder of the Patient Information Forum, Mark endeavours to make healthcare more patient-centric. As the Chief Patient Officer for MD Healthcare, he works with several healthcare organisations to harness digital health, improve market access, and embed patient engagement in healthcare products and services. Thanks so much for joining us today, Mark.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
No, we're grateful to have you here. So just before we sort of jump into the conversation, you obviously wear a lot of different hats in the healthcare space, and we thought it'd be interesting to hear a little bit about your journey and how you became to be interested in digital health and health data.
So as you can hear from the funny accent, I'm Scottish originally. I studied pharmacy in Aberdeen, and I came back to Glasgow and I did my pre-registration year where you practice for a year in hospital pharmacy, running leukemia clinics, which was incredibly emotional. And the other 6 months in industry, which interestingly enough was the opposite. And I thought to myself, let me try what that was called community pharmacy. So I went into community pharmacy, didn't really enjoy that, and thought, okay, I've tried all 3 areas of pharmacy. What do I do now? And I fell into a job working with a company called Healthcare International. That was where my journey with digital health started. I ended up installing an electronic health record system, the pharmacy component of what is now known as a Cerner system. I believe there's 23 hospitals in the UK or thereabouts that have a Cerner system. So we basically developed this in the early 90s, supposedly to become Europe's first paperless hospital. There still seem to be a lot of paper in the hospital, but that was my introduction, so to speak, to digital health. I then moved away and went to Gibraltar, of all places, and I ran a pharmacy in Gibraltar, installed a patient medication system there, and again saw the benefits that digital could bring to patients, to clinicians, myself as the lead pharmacist, but also to stock control. And I thought, oh, there's something interesting here. I went to the King's Fund as well, did some work there, and that's where I got bitten by the patient bug. And so through the last 3 decades, the 2 themes that have really been running through my career to date has been, where's the patient in all this? And if and where suitably co-created with end users, can digital support that engagement process with patients, with clinicians, with managers? I'd also add that I do, for the last 15 years, wear the patient hat. So I was diagnosed in my mid-40s with type 2 diabetes. I'm not in remission at the moment, having had a couple of weeks holiday and the summertime and all the rest of it, but hopefully going to get my bloods back under control.
Thanks, Mark. I think it's great that your focus is to bring the patient into all of this, because that's pretty much exactly the focus and theme of Not Just Patients. So that seems like the perfect fit to have you here. I also think that it's great that it's been 3 odd decades of you working in digital. And I think to a lot of people, digital is something that only just happened 5 years ago. But clearly there's been decades worth of progress and transition. And so we'd love to learn more about that. But maybe we can just start with some basics and we can define digital health and health data for our listeners.
I think digital health can cover a whole bunch of things. I think it needs to cover any type of digital interaction. As you've said, we used to call it IT, information technology. It's now become digital. I think health also needs to cover care. It needs to cover well-being. It needs to cover lifestyle. And I think sometimes we get a little bit, as we do with the word medicine, we get a little bit paternalistic and a little bit too professional with the terminology. And I think health data is another interesting one. Is health data what's contained in your electronic health record, and who owns your electronic health record? Is it in the UK, me as a citizen? Is it the Secretary of State? Is it my general practitioner? And what happens, for example, in clinical trials with data that I'm submitting to trials? Is that the clinical research organization's data? Is it the sponsor's data? Is it my data? What happens if I'm taking wearable data? And I'm sure we'll get into lots of this stuff. So I think we need to just be aware that we have a model that we've been using for many years that talks about what I'd call the medical model that does 2 patients. we are moving and have moved into the sort of charity model where we do for patients, and we're all now talking about a social model where we do with. But I think we need to go further, and I think we need to look at the model that says from patients, because ultimately real world evidence, whether it's being used in a trial setting, a clinical trial setting for developing medicines or developing med tech, or whether it's used in a health system service in terms of trend analysis of blood pressures or looking at people's behavior, it's my data. So I think my definitions would be really starting with the end user and whose data and whose devices it is.
I think that's certainly a lot to think about, because as you say, when I'm thinking of health data, I don't usually have a name or a face on it. And that's quite often, of course, it's anonymized. But of course, I have my own health data that's in a record somewhere. And that's something that is mine, but it can be used and aggregated in other ways. So I'm absolutely sure that we're going to touch on that a little bit later and kind of the ethics around that. But just to jump back onto what we were saying before about the digital health solutions and therapeutics piece. So what are some examples of what that could be, and how can they be used to enhance patient care?
One company that I worked with here in Manchester that sadly is no more because of the who pays issue was a company called Greater Moments. Their approach was to work with patients with dementia and their main caregivers, and they set up a very simple system that basically recorded the greatness of the moments that they had outside of healthcare settings in social activities. And I think that's the other point, is we sometimes get focused on health and forget about care, and forget about the bigger citizen piece, or looking at patients as people beyond the medical model. And what that did was, whether it was going to a library, walking down a canal, listening to music, watching television, they began to record for these patients with dementia what gave the patient, and to some degree the caregiver, the most delight. And what that app began to do was to collect that information and then start presenting other opportunities to both the patient with dementia, where they had the ability and cognitive ability to make choice, but also their main caregivers to choose those moments that were greatest, and to begin to look at their diary and link it up with local activities, and to bring those people with dementia to those events. It wasn't a therapeutic intervention from a sort of medical model point of view, but it gave delight to these people. It gave delight to their caregivers. And to me, that's amazing, because that's the ability of digital health to collect outcomes data, to link it into social data, and to provide avenues and opportunities for patients and caregivers to get more from life, not just more from a product or from a medicine.
I just love that, because when you think digital and technology, the natural definition is devoid of human emotion and feeling. And, it's kind of almost at odds, you would think, with the human side of things. But this is like a perfect example of that, of marrying those two, and where digital is being used to enhance quality of life in a very meaningful way.
And I think also, the question then comes, well, hold on a minute, and this is the issue, who would pay for that? Because it's difficult to see where that increased quality of life would be paid for by a medically driven healthcare system. And that was one of the issues. And sometimes in this country, in the UK, we have health and social care coming from, one budget and different budgets. And sometimes you think to yourself, well, hold on a minute, it's unfair perhaps to be only a B2C model where caregivers who can afford it can pay for it. Again, in our public system, we try to keep things equitable, but it's difficult to find who pays for that service because it doesn't fit the normal model. It's not a medicine that's improving some sort of clinical outcome. It's a digital intervention. It's improving a quality of life measure that isn't really joy, happiness, resilience, confidence. And we are looking at QALYs, and there's a new thing called the WALY, which is the wellness-adjusted life years. So we are beginning to think a little bit more person-centric in terms of how we measure value and outcomes in healthcare, but we're still quite medically driven.
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, in the medical world, medicines are now being measured a little bit more to do with how they improve quality of life as well. So in clinical trials, there are some models that can be used to see, is it improving quality of life? I know that when the NHS in the UK is deciding whether they're going to reimburse something, they use cost per quality of life measure as well. So there are those quality of life measures built in when, like you say, when we're talking about a medicine. But then, it becomes sort of the grey area about who reviews something when it's not a medicine. It's to do just with the quality of life aspect. And I suppose that's where people who provide reimbursement for medicines differ from whoever it is who may pay for a digital health solution that isn't necessarily, as you say, improving clinical outcomes as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I remember having an argument with the pharma company that ran the Salford lung study, which several years ago was at that time sort of one of the largest, if not the largest, real-world evidence studies done in my backyard, so to speak, here in the Greater Manchester area. And one of the challenges I made to them was that they weren't really collecting sufficient PREMS, PROMS, quality of life measures. So, patient-reported experience or patient-reported outcome measures. It was looking at forced expiratory volume and all these wonderful respiratory measures. But I said, how many people with severe asthma or COPD feel like prisoners in their own home? They can't play with their grandchildren. They can't go for a walk to the shops to buy a pint of milk. These are quality of life measures that are really important. And, the company was like, well, what do you want us to do? Have a headline that says, our medicine helps release 5,000 people from the prison of their own homes. I said, yes, that's far more effective than X% of patients showed that their forced expiratory volume increased by Y%. I mean, hello, think person, think people. And they were like, you're crazy.
And unfortunately, I don't think the regulations would allow for that.
Yeah, but again, without lambasting the regulators are here to serve and to protect. But I sometimes think they overprotect and underserve because, again, they have a sort of risk aversion. They're in the sort of medical model type of thing, and I'm not au fait with regulations around the FDA or the AMA, but where are wearables? Where is my data, the data that's on my smartphone? Can I submit that to trials? Why not? What is sufficiently clinical grade and medically validated that I can now contribute that data? And I have to challenge sort of both medicine and regulators to say, what is good enough? What quality of patient-generated data or person-generated data can now be used to inform trials? And I sometimes think we hide a little bit behind the clinical model and the medical model. And I think we do need to open it up to, yes, validated devices, but to look at what's person-centric, not just medical-centric.
Right. So, Mark, this podcast is all about patient engagement, as you know. And in a previous episode, we've spoken about patient engagement in pharma and in the drug development process. So, how far along would you say digital health is with regard to patient engagement?
Well, it's interesting. So there's a couple of trade associations here in the UK. There's the ABPI, the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, which is the medicines developers. And then there's the ABHI, the Association of British Healthcare Industry, which tends to be the medtech side of things. And generally speaking, I'm going to maybe get shot for this, but pharma tend to do more patient engagement than medtech. Now, that's, I think, partly because pharma has more money and medtech is more commoditized. So I think there's something there about being unable to necessarily fund all the patient engagement activities that happen. I personally, in my own day job, am making small inroads in working with a number of medtech companies to begin to get them to think about patient engagement, about co-creation, about informed consent. But I'm still surprised and shocked by how many medtech devices and digital health technologies that are patient-facing have not spoken to a patient. And, we're seeing that reversal in pharmaceutical companies with patients very much involved through all the clinical phases, involved in health technology assessment. Many of the people that listen will be familiar with the UPATI roadmap, which clearly outlines, where people can get involved in the sort of medicines development. And I think we need to take that type of roadmap and do a couple of things with it. One is update it. Two is to actually identify on that roadmap what is mandated from a regulatory point of view and where good practice exists along each of those points. But I think we also need to expand it to medtech and to digital health, and indeed to take it over the barrier, so to speak, into the commercial world, and not just look at engagement in R&D, but also look at engagement in market access when the product's out there. If we could tailor information through digital channels so that you didn't just get the product, but you got a wraparound service around what is this medicine? What is this digital health app? What is this device? And what does it mean to me? How can it talk to me? We can do that. We do that with hotel bookings. We do that with so many other things that we personalize information. And in healthcare, we're still playing catch up. I don't get it.
We spoke a little bit about the comparison between pharma and medtech. And I think one big question is around the regulations for digital health. Are they as strictly regulated as, say, medicines that go through the whole R&D and approval process? And maybe I would like to understand who pays for medtech, at least in the UK. I'm sure that it's different in different parts of the world. I'm just wondering if it makes sense that whatever processes are in place for medtech, maybe those seem like a natural fit to be extrapolated to all these digital technologies in general. Do you think that's the case?
So it depends what you begin to call it. And it goes
Mhm.
back to your very opening comment. Is this digital health? Is this a digital therapeutic? Is this a digital pharmaceutical? So Teva I still think that they have an inhaler, a smart inhaler, and they called it specifically a digital pharmaceutical because what that then allowed them to do was have the pharmaceutical reimbursed that had a digital element to it. When it became a digital therapeutic, it was a new category,
Mm.
and therefore it was difficult for regulators and for health technology assessors to put into a new bucket. So there's interesting ways as to how you define this. I've sat on a couple of boards of something called the Digital Therapeutics Alliance, DTA, and they've published some great work globally. They've done, I think, 8 to 10 pathways of how digital therapeutics are funded and can potentially paid for through Germany, Japan, I think even China, the US. So looking at their website would be great. There's also another organization called DIME. They've also been doing some interesting work. These organizations have been looking at this very topic, and ABHI has a dedicated digital health group that is looking at digital health. And back to your point about remuneration, in the UK, the government is currently looking at the remuneration of medtech generally. It tends to be more commoditized, it tends to be cheaper than medicines, but they're still looking at that whole topic area. And again, digital health has a sort of dotted line into, is it a pharmaceutical? Is it a medtech? Is it sit in between? So the jury's out. NICE has published some evidence on it around what you need to show the evidence that your therapeutic or your digital health product works, but it's still quite new. And I look at lots of stuff in the digital health side, and everybody gets very excited when the FDA approves a digital therapeutic because it's still quite new. I think Sleepio has just been approved. There's another one, I think, for ADHD, I think has been approved in America. But it's interesting stuff. And then you get into AI and, the biases that AI introduces. Oh, my goodness. It's so new, it's still a bit of a minefield, to be honest.
So those two that have been approved in the US that you talked about, just so that we can get an understanding of what a digital health solution might look like, can you give us any more information on those?
Well, Sleepio is interesting, and I'm not an expert, I'm more of a generalist, but I think Sleepio is a now approved, NHS approved, and seems to be FDA approved intervention for insomnia, and it's digital. But if you go onto the NHS website, look up insomnia and then look up treatments, it's not mentioned there. And I wonder to myself, well, if it's been approved by the NHS and we're going back to shared decision making and informed and empowered consumers, we need to be able to know what to ask for. So, it has that part of the NHS that's publishing data, allowing patients to make informed choices, not caught up yet with the other part that says it's now regulated in an approved therapy. So I think it's back to your point earlier about systems are not quite aligned yet. I don't know if I went to the average GP and said, hi, could you please prescribe me the Sleepio digital therapeutic for my insomnia? I'm not sure whether they'd go, sure. It's still very much in its infancy. And I think the evidence is growing for digital therapeutics. I think we still have issues about how we price them, how we pay for them, how we prescribe them, how we evaluate them in real practice. Because it's so new, we don't necessarily have the system set up in place. If we've been using medicines since the inception of the NHS and before in 1948, and we're still struggling a little bit with closing the loop on medicines usage, how much more so are we struggling with some of this? Although that said, this is real-time data we're getting. So this is, you're carrying often these therapeutics, the digital therapeutics in your hand. And often we have a much better feedback loop than we do with medicines. So I think there's real opportunity with digital to answer some of the questions we've not been able to do with non-digital products.
Yeah, I think one can only hope that, when it comes to most technologies that are old school and not digital, or even pharmaceuticals for that matter, the change curve or the time it takes for things to change and for things to be set up and established and all is so slow. But when it comes to anything digital, that curve is so fast. I mean, just in terms of the adoption, that curve is so fast. So it's just even more important, I think, that regulators and all really get their act together to kind of accelerate that process on all fronts. Because clearly, if patients are seeing some benefit in using these, they're just going to keep using them. But then that whole access problem arises and equity and all of that, for which we need the regulators and the authorities to kind of get on board and accelerate that.
Yeah, and I think there's a theme running through some of the stuff we've been talking about, which is, where is patient power? And ultimately, if information is seen as a therapy and we want to be making shared decision making and informed choice, I need to understand what all my choices are. What is available in the NHS in the UK? What's available in the private healthcare system? How can I look at the pros and cons of each of those interventions and make a decision as to what is best for me? Now, that's quite a high level of health literacy and indeed digital literacy. I don't know about you, but when it comes to mortgages, I need to get a financial advisor in and help me because I don't understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Who is that healthcare navigator? Who is that healthcare advisor or advocate that helps me with these decisions, especially where I don't have, in my case, a clinical background, and I struggle, you know? So I think there's something in America. I've noticed there's a lot of work around healthcare advocacy, and you have paid advocates, you have healthcare navigators, and we're beginning to use that here. I think some of the cancer charities are beginning to employ and engage people to become navigators, because it's getting difficult. I'm an old-fashioned guy. You know, when my wife would say to me 25 years ago, go and buy me some honey, you know, I'd go to the supermarket and buy honey. Now when she says go and buy me some honey, I stand there and go, well, do you want it from, like, you know, Heather from wherever? Do you want it from here? Do you want it in a squeezy bottle? Do you want it? And she's like, just get me honey. And I'm like, I can't, there's a whole row. What do you mean? It's choice paralysis. And that's in just buying honey. Can you imagine what it's like when it comes to your healthcare? And you've got, well, here's a surgical intervention, and here's a medicines intervention, and here's a digital intervention, and here's watchful waiting and doing nothing. That begins to get pretty complicated.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said, and we've had conversations on previous episodes about health literacy. But just because we're talking about digital health solutions, I wonder if we could understand a little bit more about digital literacy and how that plays into this, because I think quite a few people nowadays would say, oh, you know, you download an app on your phone, or you go into this website and click on it. And that seems sort of second nature to a lot of people. But actually, for them, people who can't do that, they might not necessarily have access. You know, when we're talking about the dementia app you were speaking about before, that might be older people who might not have a smartphone where they can download things on an app. So I think digital literacy is just increasing because of the amount we've had to use it, especially post-pandemic. But I imagine that is also a barrier to access.
I mean, we're making assumptions here, as you say, about, I think, number one, access to smartphones and digital devices. And again, we need to be thinking about what's the lowest common access channel to make it available to everybody. So we need to think about equity and access. We also need to think about those who do have a smartphone but don't necessarily afford the data. Data poverty is real. And again, some work that was done by Nesta, which is a science endowment fund that does a lot of interesting research. They published some work a couple of years ago now, and I think possibly the numbers have gone up given the cost of living issues globally. But they said that 1 million people across Scotland and Wales had to make a choice of whether to put bread on the table or data on the table, so to speak.
Wow.
So data poverty is a real issue when it comes to equity of access. So they may have the channel, but can't afford to fund the channel. So we've got to think about these things. And I think it's about what's the use case for using the technology that goes beyond, oh, well, it exists, so let's use it. I'm not against avatars and XR and VR and all these different things that I still don't quite understand. But I think it needs to show added benefit to the lowest common denominator, as opposed to using the technology for the sake of using the technology.
Yeah, I think in some ways, digital solutions, so even something as simple as a video conferencing system where you can have your appointments at home instead of traveling however many hours to the hospital, can really increase accessibility. But if that is the only option and you don't have access to an app or a laptop or something where you can have those appointments, then it's also excluding people. So it's sort of an interesting double-edged sword, I think, where digital solutions can really improve accessibility, but they can also exclude people. And I think that will be the case as more sort of digital health solutions come on the market.
Yeah, it goes back to my point about, we've got to be very careful about the language that we use. And, as we call something a digital therapeutic, does that make something inaccessible because it sounds like something new? And again, to really break down some barriers, if people are using, as they often do, devices for their finance, for their holidays, for their personal interactions, for hospitality, what we need to do is convince them that it's the same digital skills that you're using that just needs to be applied to a healthcare area. I think in the UK, we have the NHS app, and I believe there's something like 33 million users, or at least downloads of the NHS app. It was the easiest way to be able to get your COVID injections. So again, there's something about build it, they will come. Well, they won't unless there's a reason to do it. So I think it goes back to sometimes we build technologies and we build things and we go, of course people will use it, but we forget about marketing 101 and we forget about explaining clearly what the benefits of using this technology are. Supposedly every patient in the UK now has access to their full clinical record. Now, how many people are uptaking that? I don't know. I use a little bit of mine, but sometimes you think, well, what do I need that for? But if you start to say, well, actually, it helps you with prescriptions, it helps you with appointments, it helps you if you ever have to go for health insurance, if you've got travel insurance issues. If you begin to build the benefits into what the technology does, I'm not interested in how it does it, just tell me what it does for me. And I sometimes think we get focused on the tech, let's build something, as opposed to let's build something that helps you do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. So I live in Mumbai, I live in India, and I feel like some of the challenges that you were speaking about are still a bit like tying the bow on top of the gift wrapping kind of thing, because at least to begin with, you have a wrapping paper and you have those basics. And I feel like there's a very large divide there when it comes to developing countries and access and where and how this might evolve. I still think on that spectrum, India is in a fairly good place because, of course, India's very advanced in software and technology, and incidentally, smartphone penetration and internet penetration in the country is massive, and it outdoes basic sanitation in some cases as well. They might not have proper toilets, but they would have internet access. So I do think that I'm still advantaged, but there is a divide that does need to be spoken about in terms of how many more years it would take before equity is truly achieved in these areas from a global perspective.
There's a couple of points you brought up. One about assumptions that people make about, developing countries and developed countries. I think there were issues about language. There's a focus on a Western calendar and limited sensitivity to other people's calendars. So I think your point about access to technology, access to healthcare data, access, diversity comes in so many flavors and colors and creeds. And I remember, someone saying to me, we'd like to invite you to join this panel. Could you please come on the 15th of October? I said, I can't make that date, but I can come on the 25th of December. And they went, how could you possibly choose the 25th of December? I said, because the same reason you've chosen the Day of Atonement, And he was like, oh, you're going to be fun, aren't you? I said, no, I may be fun. I'm just going to open your eyes to the fact that there are different traditions and different calendars and different dates. So I think back to your point is, do developers think about that? Do they think about, even where they are doing focus groups and they're working and co-creating, we can't get everybody and we can't necessarily cater for everything, but are you thinking a little bit differently? There's a wonderful phrase that the Talmud has that it says, we see things as we are, not as they are. And every one of us has subjectivity in our life. I like Scottish people better than English people. Am I allowed to say that? Probably not. But we've all got biases, and that's okay. But as long as we're aware of them, and importantly, we adjust for them.
Yeah, which is why we not only need to talk about patient involvement and co-creation, but diverse patient involvement is always something that will benefit you and make sure that whatever you produce is accessible for everyone.
So I think that point ties in nicely to the question I was going to ask next, which is, what is the process for developing these? You did mention that very few of them actually involving patients necessarily. So can anybody just say, let's build something and start building it and then put it out there? Yeah, how does this work?
So no, it's not sort of, just, build it in your backyard and hopefully it will come. Again, within the UK, wherever you are, irrespective of healthcare, there will be, the CE mark, and there'll be digital legislation around security and data and information governance. When you then move into the NHS, the National Health Service here in the UK, there's a specific NHS information governance toolkit. There's something called DTAC, which you have to jump through. You have to look at clinical safety. You have to look at a whole user experience, thankfully. You have to look at a whole bunch of different things. Again, in the same way that we have different regulation of medicines, whether it's something called a general sales list, so you can pick it up in a garage, or whether it's a pharmacy-only medicine or a prescription-only medicine, we have the same with medical devices, and we now have similar categorization when it comes to digital health. I'm not an expert in where AI comes, and I was involved a couple of years ago, but I've not kept up to date with this. But the issue with a medicine and a med tech is they tend to stay pretty consistent. Where you then begin to bring in a digital health app and it's changing, or it's got AI and it's reiterative and generative, how do you fix that in time and say, well, that's the product, when it's forever changing? So I think that brings with it challenges, and AI is one of these things I'm a bit terrified of. But back to your question, I think, digital health solutions are regulated. Patients are not mandated, from what I understand, to be part of the process, but you would hope that whoever your end user is, whether that's a patient or a manager or a clinician, ideally the principles of co-creation, of human-centered design, of user experience, you would hope that developers go out and speak to people, not just to test products, which is great, and have reviewers, but even better to have co-creators to actually, say, here's a blank sheet of paper, this is what we'd like. Far better to be actually creating the product or the service from the outset than it is to be reviewing something somewhere down the line.
So I think that the principle of user-centered design has its roots in technology, really. And, the fact that there is a product manager in tech teams that's usually doing user research and things like that. I think that it actually might place this space ahead of pharmaceuticals, which are just about thinking, oh, we need to get patient-centric, and oh, we need to talk to the patient right at the beginning of the process and things like that. I think that if there are lots of tech startups that are building some of these things, that might be a more natural way of doing things, or at least that's what I would hope. Do you think that that's a fair assumption?
Yes. There's a short answer. I mean, I've not done a study of it, but thankfully I'm seeing a lot of effort by pharmaceutical companies in bringing the patient voice into the design and the development of drugs, i.e. before they become medicines. I'm not seeing as much of that in med tech, but I'm not as close to med tech, and some of them do it. But I think med tech, I would say, is possibly playing catch up. And then when it comes to digital health, I think I'd love to hear from digital health developers where they're at. I get the feeling that there's some digital health developers who are doing this amazingly and have set up panels and co-creation panels and patient councils and really are developing products with and for and from patients and caregivers and people. But I also think there's still a large tranche of organizations that are very techie or think they know best and tend to develop stuff themselves, and the end user engagement is a wee bit of an afterthought. Or in some cases, they use clinicians as a proxy for patients, which again, we have to be careful with as well.
Yeah, and I think generally, Clarinda and I, and I'm sure you, Mark, as well, both sort of subscribe to the fact that if you're going to create something for patients, you should create it with them and get their input as early as possible. And I think I see it as almost if you could create a therapeutic for disease X and you say this is going to really help you with fatigue, for example. You could develop a really good app to help with fatigue. But if you get to the patients at the end and they say, actually, our biggest problem is pain, not fatigue, then wasted your time, really. It's about really getting those insights to understand not only sort of how the product works, but what do the patients actually need in this space, and working with them to say what channels do people have access to. If it's something that's really visual, but it turns out that a lot of people with that disease don't have good vision, then it's not going to work. So I think there's all sorts of things that would really benefit from early involvement of patients who really live with it.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I think Scotland did some interesting stuff. It was the patient experience program, and I've got a mug at home. It says a doctor talking to a patient and says, "What's the matter with you?" And the patient turning around and saying, "No, what matters to me?" And it's a very subtle change, but it's important. And the other side of the mug then has a nurse bringing a patient a newspaper and him saying, being profusely thankful, and the member of staff saying, "Oh, it's nothing." And the patient saying, "It may be nothing to you, but it's everything to me. You know, I'm isolated. I'm not in touch with the real world. Here I am, you giving me a newspaper that gives me ability to be free from this clinical setting, from this ward. That's what matters to me." And again, back to the points we've talked about, you can't capture that in a healthcare medical driven system. And it's the little things that matter. And I think that's true, whether it's developing a digital therapeutic or a medicine. It's the little wraparound stuff that matters.
Yeah, and I think I'll speak for the UK specifically, but with the NHS struggling slightly at the moment with terms of resource capacity, if there are solutions that can help patients get access to things they need by supporting the system. So whether it's that I can just make an appointment on an app without needing to sit on hold on the phone for ages, or whether it's, can have a delivery or can submit some test results because I've got a lung function meter at home and I can send it in so that they've got that without me having to go to the clinic and without there needing to be a nurse available, then that's something that can really support both the patient by making it easier for them and also the system.
If it's joined up, and for example, I made an appointment the other day to go and get my bloods done, which I do every 3 months. And I realized in this conversation that I haven't put it in my diary. Now it's in the app, but I never look at the app other than to use it. So you've reminded me now that I need to go and take it and stick it in my diary. What would have been simple is an email reminder to go to my, or an automatic to go to my calendar. Yeah. And I'm thinking, guys, this is simple stuff, or should be simple stuff. So again, it's back to your point about, number one, can you access it? Number two, as you say, is it seamless to use? And sometimes the interface isn't intuitive. I've found myself sitting looking at something and not knowing exactly where to click or what to use. And then when you've done it, it should say, here's a WhatsApp, here's a text, anything that's free, so to speak. And it happens in some places, doesn't happen in others. So I still think there's inconsistency. I still think there's poor user experience and user design. There's a long way to go before we have very seamless activities. It's a bit like, I don't know about you guys, but when I sit in a chair that's really comfortable, I go, "Ooh, that's a comfortable chair."
Yeah.
I'm thinking, how can that be? Why are there hundreds of millions of chairs that are uncomfortable to sit in? It's a bloody chair. Make it comfortable. And I'm a bit like this with digital health. Why should it be that the exception is me going, "Ooh, that was a seamless experience," as opposed to it just being invisible? It just happens. We're still a long way away from that.
Yeah.
Mark, you've made me very conscious of how comfortable my chair is.
So switching tracks now and talking about data, I think that globally everyone's become a lot more aware of privacy, and we've had GDPR and we have cookies and all of these things that people are, whether they understand it or not, they're aware that there is a privacy angle. I'm consenting to something here. So I think that becomes critical when it comes to health data. And you briefly touched upon electronic medical records and health data, but where does this whole data collection piece fit? Who's allowed to collect it? Where does it stay? What are the ethical concerns? What should patients be worried about or not worried about?
Right. So as you say, we've got GDPR and what's the benefits of that? What's the downside of that? We've got the information governance toolkits. We're all familiar, at least I am, many, many, many years ago, of somebody, and I won't mention the pharmaceutical company, but from a pharmaceutical company who at that time was producing the leading world antidepressant, sending out an email and having all the patients in the 2 field, not in the blind carbon copy in the BCC field. So, before we even get into apps and digital technology, although you could argue email is digital, we're making mistakes. Electronic health records, are they more protected than the paper records that are sitting on surgeries? When you sit down with your doctor, you see a whole bunch of papers and you could need somebody's name. You could potentially in hospitals walk into the paper held records place and look through records. So again, we need to be aware that we don't jump on the bandwagon of, oh, digital is dangerous and it's not secure enough, when actually, if we sometimes look at the paper alternative, it's either just as secure or just as insecure. I think you raise a really interesting point, and one I don't have an answer for, but whose data is this? Is this data the pharmaceutical companies, the clinical research organisation, the provider, the NHS Trust in our case? Is it the HMO or the commissioner? Is it the patients? Is it the doctors? So, we published a paper 15 years ago in the UK called Whose Data Is It Anyway? And I seem to recall the conclusion was that health data, and this may be wrong now, the responsibility of the ownership sat with the Secretary of State for Health, which is quite interesting. Now, whether that's true or not, again, I'd love to hear from people in feedback, but there's a wonderful doctor, Amir Hanan, who works here in the northwest of England. He'd know the answer to that. Amir, just on the point of who do you trust, turned up in Dr. Shipman's practice. Now, you may not be familiar globally, but Dr. Shipman was an infamous, sadly, doctor who murdered many, many of his patients. And Amir took over his practice. And one of the things he said was, I'm going to open every record to everybody. And so he now has thousands and thousands of patients who have full access to their records, irrespective of their ethnic background. So, he's overcome some of that challenge we touched on earlier about diverse access, about ensuring things in different languages. So I think that's a really interesting perspective and a really great model. Now, we do get into some interesting debates about sealed envelopes, which is where there's a mental health issue, where there's a sexual health issue, and you don't want to necessarily let parents know, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all these issues around sensitivity about, who can access what records, can parents access children's records, can they access everything on records? But my personal trust issue isn't so much with big pharma and medtech, not even possibly with insurers. My slight concern, if not grave concern, is with Facebook, Amazon, Google. I remember buying a piece of Lego, not that I'm advertising that particular toy above any others. And then I was playing like a word game on my phone, and every advert that came up was Lego, 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 Lego. And I thought, this is a bit scary. And all of us have got these mythical or factual stories about talking about something in front of some of these devices, and all of a sudden, you're talking about a holiday in Barbados, which you could never afford, but you're talking about your rich friends. And all of a sudden, you get stuff that keeps popping up telling you, do you want to go on holiday to Barbados? So I'm a bit worried, less about the healthcare players and more about the data players and what they're up to and their transparency around this. What is big data doing with my stuff?
Yeah, because I'd like to hope that obviously your records and any sort of secure files that you may have will be closed. But if you're Googling something to do with your own health or disease, if you're asking, Google, ChatGPT, you're looking at a Facebook group on it, then they can put things together to profile you and assume that you have something to do with that disease, whether you have it or not. And
so they must be getting very confused by patient advocates.
Yeah.
And again, we talked earlier about definitions of health data. In my day job, we work with Flatiron Health. They deal with data from electronic health records looking specifically at cancer and oncology. And they've been amazing. I mean, they've been an absolutely amazing company to work with in the UK because they've embraced the whole patient engagement piece. We co-created our panel with 2 patients as to what the role and the person description should be. We've recruited with patients to get patients involved. We've got 6 patients on our patient voices panel. And we were keen to get patients into that who didn't even know what the term health data meant. Because if we can begin to work with you to describe and you tell us what we need to tell you, that will help everybody get involved in this. If you went out in the street and you said to people, what is health data? I'd be really interested in what people were saying. I'd be really interested.
I don't think anyone would talk to me in London, unfortunately, but I'll let you know how that goes. But it's an interesting point, and I think a lot of people maybe don't think about it. So with regard to, for example, your electronic health records that you'd have, for example, in the NHS, obviously they wouldn't be using it to identify me, but they might be using it sort of aggregated to understand some population health statistics. And I personally think that's fine, but also I'm not aware that that's what they're using my data for, which is, I think, maybe a little bit of a disconnect and why people might not have trust in a system kind of having their data on file. And yeah, I mean, don't get me started on the hacks that have been happening, I think, globally, not just in the healthcare systems, but in all sorts of systems.
Yeah. You also bring up a really interesting thing, which is about people's understanding of risk, which is poorly understood. So what is it? The chance of winning the lottery in most countries is the same as being hit by lightning. And I don't even know the statistic, but we're very bad at risk communication and don't understand risk communication. So, and because we tend to focus on the news, on the thing that broke, as opposed to the thing that worked, you tend to hear more of these things. So the power of one becomes the power of many, as opposed to simply being a one-off. And educating our children about health literacy, about data literacy, about digital literacy, and not to give away your identity, and some of these things that are absolutely basic.
I was going to say that when we're talking about data security and the laws and, you know, the policies that need to be in place for that, it's an interesting conundrum, because is that under the purview of the Information and Technology Ministry or the Health Ministry when it comes to health data? And are those ministries even ever talking to each other?
I read a slightly tongue-in-cheek article this morning, so it's interesting you bring this up, that said, you know, again, and forgive me for being UK focused, but it's not really a national health service, it's a national sickness service. That's what it is, and call it what it is. What we then need is a Department of Health Prevention or Illness Prevention or Department of Health Promotion. And we played around with these things. We need the Department of Transport to be the Department of Transport and Health. We need the Department of Work and Pensions to be the Department of Work and Pensions and Health. So where we add health into all the government ministries and look at the WHO Sustainable Development Goals, we need to make health, as the World Health Organization says, not just an absence of disease, but actually something where it's a physical, a mental, a financial type of positive stuff. And I think, sadly, in healthcare, we focus too much on a deficit model of healthcare and not the asset model of healthcare. And one of the things you see with my fellow, mainly type 1 patients with diabetes, is those who are really technology savvy, back to your point about security, they're the ones that are breaking into some of these devices that are already regulated in order for those devices to do things that the regulators and the manufacturers don't want them to do yet. So again, that's interesting. So there you've got patient centricity and a patient demand and a patient need actually breaking the law, in inverted commas, in order to get the technology to do what they want it to do. Now, that's a really interesting conundrum. Is that wrong?
It is interesting, because I guess if you're changing something on your own device, I'm sure that the pharmaceutical companies or device company will say, no, do not do that. But if you do it to the own device, at least if something goes wrong, the only person in a way you can blame is yourself, unless you blame the company for allowing you to make those changes. But then if you then publish it on Reddit and say you can make these changes this way, are you then endangering other people? And then is that a problem? It's interesting, kind of both ethically and legally, where to draw the line in terms of what is okay and allowed or not.
Yeah.
So, Mark, I think that you've been in this space for really long, and we'd love for you to, you know, look into your crystal ball now and maybe tell us what you see in the future a little bit. I think that the pace of digital evolution is just unparalleled, and I don't even know if 3 years from now I'll be able to keep up, really. But it would be interesting to hear how you see that unfolding.
It's a great question, and one I've not really pondered much, but let me just reflect on that. And I think for me, so wearing my diabetes hat, who's somebody who struggles with food management and doesn't do enough activity, I would like a personalized app on my phone that is for me and talks to Mark. And I've set it at whatever degree of intervention I want it, you know, really annoy me or leave me alone. I'd like it to be able to look at my food, and I know that some stuff's beginning to do this, and accurately say, this is the number of calories in this. I'd like it to track my activity, as I'm already beginning to do, to know what my electronic health record says, and to tell my doctor, whether they choose to look at it or not, how many calories I had that day, whether I took my medicines, and to be able to track whether I took those medicines, to be able to see my blood glucose, you know, 24/7, and to be able to literally say to me, as my fellow diabetics are with type 1, this is your graph, this is where things are at, you need more of this, you need less of that. I just love a little bit of Star Trek technology, which I think is probably here, completely combined into one place that is just my personal assistant. Then, I've got to go for cataract surgery. I don't want a bulky, horrible leaflet coming through that costs somebody X pounds to print and Y pounds to post. I want that to appear as an annotated PDF or whatever it may be in the channel that I want. So I think my future would be something that starts with me and finishes with me. I've clearly expressed what my information needs are. I've clearly expressed my attitude to risk. I'm fully informed. If I don't understand something, I can easily access a healthcare navigator to help me understand some of those issues. If I want to talk to someone else who's been there, done it, who happens to be 56, Jewish, XYZ, I can reach out through a peer-to-peer group, through the NHS app or whatever it may be, to have a conversation with that person to reassure me. That's the future I want. And I actually think it's here, but it's just not tied together yet.
I agree. And if it could also send something to the smart fridge and deliver your meal and cook it for you, that would be great too, I think.
Maybe 3D print it for you.
Well,
Yeah.
and I think there's a balance between convenience and skills and laziness. And do you know what I mean?
I totally agree. I was just
in
my own Back to the Future
yes,
headspace.
but I think it's an important point. I think what we need to be doing is making sure that within healthcare, we start with prevention, we look at self-care, we look at self-management. And ultimately what we're trying to do is use technology and an understanding of the end user to keep us away from the need to use healthcare in the first place. And that could be about, sugar taxes and policy stuff and wearing seatbelts and brushing your teeth twice a day. There needs to be a lot more public health and health psychology in healthcare than it currently is. There's too much medicine and too much technology at the moment. That's my worry.
I agree with everything you're saying. And I do think there's an interesting trend in society for sort of wellness and everything. I've seen there's a Zoe study, which gets you a continuous glucose monitor and blood test, and it tells you what you should be eating that will be good for your health and your gut and your health goals and everything. And that's not an NHS service. That's something people are paying for. And a lot of people do pay for personal trainers or nutritionists to kind of make themselves healthier, not necessarily as a treatment, but as a preventative thing or to make their health better. And I think there is a trend towards that. And if the healthcare system could harness those kind of things and have those kind of initiatives as well. I know it does happen for some things like smoking cessation and eating healthier, but if we can incorporate some more of those initiatives, then I think it would have a really good impact on society health.
Yeah, I think the issue we have at the moment, and I really go back to this, is I really don't think we understand health psychology and behavioral change and nudges enough. I still think we keep catering to a sort of middle class, it feels a bit like, and increasing health inequalities rather than closing that divide. And I think we really need to embrace different insights, different data. When I talked earlier, Clarinda, about what do you want in the future, that's not just what I want, but I think what maybe society needs is something that caters to each individual and their needs, but at the same time says, come on, you could be doing a little bit better. Get up earlier, do a little bit more exercise. In the tone of voice that you need to hear, that you see it as positive and supportive and encouraging, as opposed to paternalistic and, depression-inducing.
Yeah, great. So I think that's a great vision for the future. And I think we are moving in that direction, and we just have to get the tech as that's evolving and the health initiatives to kind of work together and keep up with each other in that way. And I think we probably will be getting there in the next few years, which would be fantastic.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
So just to wrap this conversation up, we wondered if you'd have any advice for patients who want to effectively embrace digital health solutions to better enhance their care.
Yeah, I think one of the things would be to become more health and digital literate. So, don't be scared to look at ego labs, talk to a neighbor, talk to your kids, talk to your granny, who may be a silver surfer. Really focus on understanding your digital literacy across all areas, but then also specifically thinking a little bit about your health literacy. I think secondly, don't be scared to volunteer and co-create. Does your GP surgery, for example, have an old-fashioned patient participation group that meets every 6 to 8 weeks? and you can sit there and say, well, I had problems getting online, or I would really like this to happen, or the district nurse saw me and she was rude. And I think patient experience is really important. And then I think thirdly, don't be scared to share your expectations and outcomes of care. So don't be scared to say, I really want to be able to do this. So don't be scared to ask the same questions you would ask of a financial advisor, of a coach, of a business advisor, of anybody you'd use. Begin to take a stand, or more of a stand. Speak up.
Thanks, Mark. That makes a lot of sense. And again, I think that patient empowerment is in a place where people are already starting to do some of these things, and hopefully that'll just get better. What would be your advice for other stakeholders looking to use digital technology solutions to accelerate improving patient care?
So 2 things. One is understand whom and where your users are at. Fundamentally, don't build it and hope that they will come. Build it with them. So back to that co-creation theme. Lloyds Bank did some really interesting work over the last few years through COVID to have a consumer digital index. We're very good at talking about the digital maturity of organizations or countries. I think we need to be talking about the digital maturity of individuals and of citizens. And secondly, having understood where your audience is at as best as you can, don't stop there, but get them in to co-create and develop it with you. Even better, ask patients to innovate. And there's a wonderful website I'll share with you in Portugal called Patient Innovation, which begins to collate and list where patients have developed information and solutions. And I think it goes back to our opening comment. Let us in and we will do more.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Mark. We've loved having this conversation. I'll admit I felt a little out of my depth when I began, but I think that this has been really enlightening, and you've made it easy for us to feel a little more tech savvy maybe than we are. So thanks so much for your time and all these lovely insights and great resources you've shared.
Pleasure. And as I said, really, really appreciate you giving me the opportunity and for even taking the initiative to have the Not Just Patients podcast. I think that's absolutely fantastic. Well done, you.
Thanks, Mark. And I think one of my favourite things is just, obviously, none of us have all the answers, but it's good to discuss and get that conversation going to figure out, where the sticking points are and how things need to change and evolve to better fit what patients need, and also just the evolving world around us as well.
Yeah. I'll leave on this point. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth. And if we listen twice as much as we speak, we will be better medics, we will be better parents, we will be better spouses, we will be better people.
Yeah.
I think we'll all be in a much better place.
I love
That's
that.
lovely. Yeah. Super.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Thanks so much.
So, Clarinda, we've just had a really insightful conversation with Mark. And just for the last few minutes, I thought we could reflect a little bit on our key learnings.
So I think one big question that I came into this conversation with is, what is digital health and what are digital therapeutics? And what emerged is that there's no universal definition. Even from the regulatory standpoint, what qualifies is kind of evolving, and the space is evolving because it's really new. But I guess my understanding of it after this conversation is any kind of health solution that is grounded in technology or born of a digital element or a device. So that clarification helped me understand the space a little better. And what was also clear was that not all our questions have answers at this point, and that's okay because it is new and it is evolving. But the more we keep talking about these unanswered questions, the closer we get to finding those answers, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And what I think was a really interesting thing we spoke about was that digital therapeutics, you could kind of think of it in isolation as a separate piece. But I think as this space evolved, what would be really great in the future is if the digital therapeutics can kind of form a part of a person's care and make everything really seamless. So it connects with the healthcare system to help make appointments. It can send you reminders to take your medicine. And it can also maybe be an app that physically helps you and provides some sort of wellness advice or collects your data to help you understand your own health better, see how effective a treatment is, so that it all connects together and creates one seamless experience, ideally on a piece of software or equipment that you already have, such as a smartphone. And I think that's where developing these digital therapeutics with patients is really important, because it means that you can really understand, firstly, what it is they need to make sure that it's valuable, and secondly, how can it be really practical and useful in their daily lives.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that we had some interesting conversations around equity and access as well, and around assumptions we tend to make about who can access these things, or the fact that everyone uses a smartphone, but that's not necessarily the case. And I think that it's imperative that digital solution developers actually thinking about this at a very granular level in terms of who can actually access it.
And I see an opportunity for digital therapeutics, again, really improving access to care. Again, if it was that seamless experience and it can help them connect to their doctor rather than having to travel 3 hours on a train, maybe. So I think there are some really good opportunities to help it improve access. But from a regulatory standpoint, there's still some work that needs to be done to understand how these can be reviewed and reimbursed by the system. So we're not relying on a patient to pay for these digital therapeutics.
Yeah, so I agree. So basically, lots of questions, but a very exciting space.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much for listening. This has been Not Just Patients with our guest, Mark Duman, and your hosts, Caitlin Rich and Clarinda Sarajan.